Squid Game has always been a show built on control. Control over the rules, the players, and over how far people are willing to go when survival is on the line. Every game is designed to strip away comfort, force decisions under pressure, and reveal what people value when everything else is taken from them. That's why the final structure of the series is so important. By the end, the show isn't just about winning anymore. It's about what kind of ending actually makes sense for a story that has been this structured from the beginning. And while the finale is still emotional and thematically strong, there's one major element that changes how the ending feels: Jun-hee's baby. The baby isn't a background detail. It becomes a central factor in how the final game plays out, how characters make decisions, and ultimately how the story resolves. And depending on how you look at it, that choice either adds a deeper layer to the themes or creates problems in how the finale lands. In this video, I'm breaking down every issue I had with Jun-hee's baby in Squid Game, why it changes the structure of the games, how it affects character dynamics, and why its role in the ending can feel like a narrative shortcut rather than a fully earned conclusion. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. In Season 1, In-hill makes one thing very clear. Every player in Squid Game is given a final fair chance to win. No advantages, no exceptions, no hidden conditions. The entire system is built around that idea of controlled fairness. Everyone enters willingly, everyone understands the stakes, and everyone is subjected to the exact same rules. That concept is what gives the games their structure. No matter how brutal or unfair they seem on the surface, the internal logic of the game is consistent. It's a closed system where outcomes are supposed to be determined by player choices, not outside interference. But the introduction of Jun-hee's baby begins to disrupt that system in a subtle but important way. Unlike every other participant, the baby never chose to enter the games, never agreed to the terms, and never had the ability to understand the consequences of participation. And yet, it becomes treated as a player within the structure of the final stages. That alone creates an immediate inconsistency, because the foundation of fairness in Squid Game is based on voluntary participation under equal conditions. From a narrative perspective, the baby's inclusion also appears to serve a larger structural purpose. Its presence influences the voting process before the final game in a way that ultimately ensures the games continue, aligning with the interests of the VIPs who are watching and influencing the system from above. In that sense, the baby doesn't just exist within the game, it indirectly affects the system that controls which games are played and how the final round is shaped. This is where the idea of fairness starts to feel more complicated, because once the baby is recognized as a player, the nature of decision making inside the game changes. Players are no longer operating purely under individual survival logic. Instead, they're now forced to consider the well being of someone who cannot act on their own. That introduces a dependency that didn't exist in earlier rounds, and shifts the balance of the competition in a way that isn't symmetrical. In a game that is supposed to test individual will, strategy, and survival instinct, the presence of a dependent participant introduces a new layer of moral and emotional decision making. That's not inherently a bad storytelling choice, but it does change the way the game functions. Choices are no longer just about self-preservation, they're also about protection, sacrifice, and responsibility. The issue is that this shift doesn't come from within the original rules of the game. It's introduced externally, which makes it feel less like an organic evolution of the system and more like a structural adjustment made to guide the story in a specific direction. That becomes especially noticeable when you consider how the final game might have played out without the baby being treated as a participant. Without that constraint, the endgame opens up different possibilities. For example, Gi-hun attempting to carry Jun-hee across the bridge becomes a viable, if extremely risky, scenario. It would introduce tension based on coordination and trust, rather than a predetermined condition tied to protecting a registered player. Even if that attempt failed, the existence of that possibility would create a different kind of narrative pressure, one that stems from player choice rather than structural limitation. Instead, the baby's role effectively narrows the range of possible outcomes. Its presence helps ensure that the final game occurs in a specific format, and that the ending converges towards a particular type of resolution. In that sense, the baby doesn't just participate in the game, it influences the condition under which the game reaches its conclusion. Another consequence of this show is how it reframes the idea of fairness within the Squid Game universe. On the surface, the system claims to treat all players equally, but the introduction of a participant who exists outside the original contract, yet is still counted within the rules, creates a contradiction. It suggests that fairness is not as absolute as it appears, and that the system itself can be adjusted when it benefits those in control, particularly the VIPs, who ultimately have influence over how the games are structured and continued. This ties back into one of the core themes of the series, that power and control often exist behind the scenes, shaping outcomes in ways that the participants themselves cannot fully see or influence. The baby, in this context, becomes less of an isolated narrative element and more of a symbol of how external forces can intervene in a system that is supposed to be rigid and equal. At the same time, its presence also has a very direct impact on how the finale feels from a viewer's perspective, because the final stages of the game are no longer centered purely around individual players competing against each other. Instead, a significant portion of the tension revolves around the survival of the baby. That shifts the emotional focus away from a broader set of competing characters and narrows it toward a single focal point that many decisions revolve around. As a result, the ending feels less like an accumulation of multiple character arcs converging naturally, and more like a scenario where one element has a disproportionate influence on how everything resolves, and that's where the critique comes in. Squid Game builds its identity on consistency, consistent rules, consistent stakes, and consistent consequences, but the introduction of the baby, particularly in the way it is treated as a player, introduces a variable that doesn't fully align with that internal logic. It reshapes how fairness is defined, it alters how decisions are made, and it influences how the final outcome is reached. So while the baby may carry thematic meaning and symbolic weight, its role within the structure of the game changes the mechanics of the finale in a way that can feel slightly disconnected from the rest of the series' established framework. Beyond how the baby changes the structure of the game, the bigger issue is how it affects the people inside it. Because once the baby becomes a central focus of the final stages, a lot of the story starts to revolve around protecting it, and that decision has a direct impact on how characters behave, what risks they take, and ultimately who survives and who doesn't. Instead of players primarily making decisions based on their own survival or personal goals, many of the key characters begin shifting their priorities towards the baby. And while that can make sense thematically, it also means that a significant amount of their actions are now centered around something external to their own arc. You see this most clearly with characters like Hyunju. Her decisions become increasingly focused on making sure Jun-hee and the baby are safe, even when that comes at the cost of her own awareness of danger. In a game where constant vigilance is necessary, taking on that protective role creates a vulnerability, and that vulnerability ultimately contributes to her death. Her arc becomes less about her own survival journey, and more about the consequences of prioritizing someone else over herself in a high-stakes environment. Kumja's arc follows a similar emotional trajectory, but in a different way. After everything she goes through, especially witnessing the death of her son, her motivation becomes heavily tied to protecting Jun-hee and the baby. She takes on that responsibility almost as a final act of defiance against the cruelty of the games, refusing to let harm come to them. But even in her case, the emotional weight of the baby becomes the central driving force behind her decisions, rather than her own independent survival or personal development. Then there's Gi-hun, whose entire arc has always been tied to morality, guilt, and redemption. Throughout the final episodes, he repeatedly puts himself at risk to help ensure the baby's survival. His choices align with the themes of the show: sacrifice, humanity, and protecting innocence, but at the same time, they also show how much of the final game becomes anchored around the baby's existence. By the end, his fate is directly tied to that same priority, and his final actions are shaped by the need to secure the baby's survival. So what ends up happening in that multiple major characters converge around the same focal point? Their decisions, their risks, and in some cases their deaths are all connected to this one element. On the surface, this might seem like it strengthens the emotional core of the finale, but from a character perspective, it also means that a lot of their individual arcs becomes secondary to the shared goal of protecting the baby. Instead of fully exploring each character's personal growth of their internal conflicts, their stories become partially redirected toward a single narrative objective. And because of so many characters are focused on that same objective, it also changes the balance of attention in the final game. Rather than having multiple competing arcs that intersect and create tension between players, a large portion of that tension is unified around the baby's survival. That can make the final interactions feel less varied, since many characters are effectively working toward the same outcome. This is where it starts to feel like some characters could have been explored more deeply if the baby wasn't such a central factor. Without this shared priority, the final stage of the game could have allowed for more direct conflicts between players, more independent decision-making, and more opportunities to fully develop individual arcs. Characters could have been placed in situations where their motivations clash more differently with each other, rather than aligning with a single point of focus. Even Jun-hee herself becomes part of this dynamic. Her character arc is heavily tied to the pregnancy from the start. While that naturally limits what she can physically do in the games, it also means that a large portion of her narrative identity revolves around the baby. As a result, her interactions and relationships, especially with Myung-gi, are often framed through the lens of that pregnancy, rather than a broader range of character-driven conflicts or development. And once the baby is born, her arc effectively reaches its conclusion shortly after, which makes her overall trajectory feel so tightly bounded to a single narrative thread. This doesn't necessarily make her character weak, but does mean that her development is more constrained compared to what it could have been in a different scenario. Without the pregnancy being the central defining factor, her character might have had more room to explore other aspects of her personality, her relationships, and her role within the games. So when you look at the bigger picture, the baby doesn't just change the structure of the game, it also changes how characters are used within the story. Instead of each character fully developing along with their own path, many of them become connected through a shared priority that influences their choices. While that can create moments of emotional weight, it also means that some individual arcs feel less distinct or less explored than what they could have been. The baby becomes a central point around which the final narrative resolves, and while the unification can be meaningful thematically, it also comes at a cost of reducing the variety of character-driven outcomes that could have existed if more emphasis had been placed on individual arcs than a single shared objective. At the end of the day, Jun-hee's baby isn't just a small detail in Squid Game, it's a decision that reshapes how the final stretch of the story works. It affects the rules of the game, influences player decisions, and ultimately becomes a central factor that a lot of the ending revolves around. While the themes behind it still connect to the broader message of the show about sacrifice, humanity, and the cost of survival, the way it's implemented creates some noticeable trade-offs in fairness, character focus, and narrative structure. The finale still delivers emotionally and conceptually, but the baby's role makes it feel slightly less driven by pure player choice and more guided by specific narrative direction. Anyways, that's my take. This is definitely a deeper and more analytical video, and I really got to dive into core ideological beats. If you made it to the end, drop your thoughts in the comments. Did the baby enhance the finale for you, or take away from it? If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe for more Squid Game breakdowns and analysis like this. I've got more content coming soon, so stay tuned. Peace out.